The conference room was small and the air inside it was stale. I had been sitting across from HR and my boss for 11 minutes before anyone asked me a single question about the complaint I had filed. The HR representative, a careful woman named Donna, had spent most of those minutes nodding at things my boss said. My boss, Curtis, sat to her left with the ease of someone who had already been told how the meeting was going to end. When Donna finally addressed me, she said, "Sometimes employees misunderstand leadership styles. That's quite common in dynamic departments." Curtis nodded. Then he leaned back slightly, just far enough to signal comfort, and said, "Honestly, we took a chance hiring you. I want to be transparent about that." Donna did not ask him what he meant or why he had said it. She looked briefly at the table and then looked back at me. The meeting ended 8 minutes later with a verbal warning. I was told that making formal accusations against management without clear evidence could be damaging to my own professional standing. I thanked them both and walked out with my notebook under my arm. They thought that meeting had closed something. It had opened something. I went straight back to my desk. I didn't stop at the kitchen or speak to anyone on the way. I sat down, opened my laptop, and navigated to a folder I had created 7 months earlier and named simply, Archive. Inside it were months of saved materials, email threads sorted by project, presentation drafts with metadata intact, document version histories, and a series of messages that, taken individually, each had a reasonable explanation. But read together, in sequence, they told a clear story. The most specific category was a set of emails from Curtis asking me to do one particular thing, remove my name. Not always in those exact words. Sometimes it was "let's keep the authorship clean on this one." Sometimes it was "strip the headers before you send it up." Sometimes simply "forward me the clean version." I had saved every instance. 12 of them over 8 months. At the time I had saved them the way you save something you hope you never need, out of instinct rather than intention, the way you keep a receipt for an item you expect to keep but never fully trust. Sitting at my desk after that meeting, I opened the folder and looked at the 12 emails in sequence. They did not look like instinct anymore. They looked like evidence. My name is Avery Cross. I had joined the company 3 years before that HR meeting as a junior strategist in the Marketing and Client Services department. The department had been struggling when I arrived, clients leaving quietly, deadlines treated as suggestions rather than commitments, and a general energy of managed decline that everyone had grown too familiar with to notice. Within 6 months I had rebuilt the client reporting process, developed a campaign framework that reduced the average project timeline by 3 weeks, and created a client retention strategy for an account that had been on the verge of canceling a contract representing a significant share of the department's annual revenue. The account stayed. The department's numbers improved. The managing director mentioned the department by name in a company-wide meeting for the first time in 2 years. I had been there 8 months when that happened. I had believed the work spoke for itself. I had believed that in an organization where results were tracked, the source of those results would eventually be recognizable. I was wrong. Not because the results weren't visible, they were. But visibility, I would learn, is not the same as credit. And credit, in that department, was controlled entirely by one person. The first time Curtis took credit for my work directly, I told myself it was a communication failure. I had built a full campaign strategy for a struggling client, a mid-sized retail company that had been with the firm for 6 years and whose account had been showing declining engagement for 2 quarters. I had done the analysis, identified the repositioning opportunity, designed the campaign structure, and written the proposal. I had sent the completed document to Curtis on a Wednesday afternoon. The following Tuesday I was not included in the executive presentation meeting. I found out about it through a calendar notification that appeared in error and was quickly rescinded. I learned what had been presented when the executive director sent a congratulatory email to the department. The email praised the campaign strategy by name. It described the approach and the reasoning and the projected outcomes. Every word of it was mine. When I asked Curtis about it afterward, he was relaxed and direct. He said the presentation had gone well and that the client was excited. When I asked why I hadn't been included, he said executive meetings were for department heads and that I had done a good job with the prep work. Then he said, "Team effort," and moved on to the next item on his agenda. After the first time, it was easier to see the pattern. Not because the pattern became more obvious, it had probably always been obvious, but because I stopped explaining it away. Reports I had written in full would appear in leadership updates under Curtis's name with 2 or 3 sentences changed at the top. Ideas I had introduced in team meetings would resurface 3 weeks later in executive presentations as strategic initiatives Curtis had been developing. A process improvement I had proposed and documented in a formal memo was implemented company-wide 6 months later. The implementation announcement credited Curtis with the concept. Promotions went to people who agreed with Curtis in meetings and deferred to him publicly. 2 colleagues who were objectively less productive than I was received title changes and salary adjustments within 18 months of their start dates. I watched this happen and kept working because I was building something, a body of results that I believed would eventually be undeniable. But there was a specific project that finally broke that belief. Not because it went wrong. Because it went perfectly. And the perfection of it made the erasure that followed impossible to absorb silently. The breakthrough project took me 2 full months. A major client, the Parson Group, which represented roughly 20% of the department's revenue, had been signaling dissatisfaction for 2 quarters. Their internal feedback had been escalating from concern to considering alternatives. Curtis handed the situation to me on a Friday afternoon with a short briefing and the same 2-word instruction I had been given before: fix it. I built a comprehensive recovery strategy. I redesigned the client's campaign framework from scratch, introduced a new data reporting format tailored to their internal metrics, developed a relationship management calendar that anticipated their quarterly review cycles, and personally led 2 sessions with their team before the formal proposal was submitted. Parson Group renewed. Not just renewed, expanded. Their annual contract value increased by 31%. The managing director called it the department's most significant client result in 4 years. At the company-wide review meeting, Curtis stood at the front of the room and described the Parson Group recovery as his personal turnaround strategy. A project he had conceived in response to signals he had been tracking for months. I was sitting in the 3rd row. He did not mention my name once. Something inside me that had been bending steadily for 2 years finally broke cleanly. A colleague named Oscar pulled me aside after that meeting. Oscar had been at the company longer than either Curtis or me, and he had the particular calm of someone who had watched many things happen and chosen his battles carefully. He said he wanted to say something I might not want to hear but that he thought I should know. He told me that Curtis had been describing me to senior leadership as support staff, a phrase that positioned me as someone who executed rather than someone who created. Curtis consistently framed the department's strategic work as his own vision, with the team as capable implementers. Oscar said he had watched the same pattern happen before with someone else who had eventually left the company. Then he said something specific: he's making you invisible on purpose. Because if you became visible, people would ask questions about what he actually contributes. I sat with that after he walked away. Invisible on purpose. I thought about the 12 emails in my archive. I thought about the Parson Group meeting. And I understood, for the first time, not just what was happening but why it was designed that way. An invisible contributor becomes a convenient scapegoat the moment anything goes wrong. I started documenting systematically the same week. Not just saving materials as they arrived, but actively building a structured record. I organized my archive into 5 categories. The first was original work product, every strategy document, campaign plan, and client proposal I had created, saved with original metadata showing creation date and my account credentials in the author field. The second was the email trail, every message between me and Curtis that showed me handing over completed work, and every message where he asked me to remove my name or clean a document before it moved upward. The third was a dated personal log describing significant events, conversations, and observations with times and locations noted. The fourth was a folder of external communications, messages from clients and partner contacts addressed to me specifically, referencing my work by name. The fifth was a collection of published outputs, presentations and reports where my work had appeared under Curtis's name, saved alongside the originals I had produced. I did not think of the folder as preparation for conflict. I thought of it as documentation that would keep a person from being erased entirely. The HR meeting was still 3 months away when I completed the structure. I added to it every week. The promotion opened 4 weeks after the Parson Group meeting. The position was Senior Strategist, a title that carried formal authority over project direction, a meaningful salary increase, and direct access to the Managing Director's strategy sessions. Oscar sent me a message the morning the listing appeared. It said simply, "This is yours." I thought so too. I had the results, the tenure, the client relationships, and the project record. I had been performing at the senior level informally for over a year. I prepared carefully for the internal interview, treating it with the same rigor I brought to client work, and walked out of it feeling that I had represented myself well. 2 weeks later, Curtis announced the promotion by email. The recipient was a woman named Faye, who had been with the company for 6 months, who had not led a client project independently, and who deferred to Curtis in every meeting with a consistency that had become its own kind of signature. Curtis's explanation, in a follow-up conversation that Oscar relayed to me, was that Faye had stronger leadership instincts. I recognized the phrase. It was the same one I had heard applied to Clarissa in a different context years earlier. It meant one thing: she didn't challenge him. The final moment that triggered the HR complaint came 3 weeks after Faye's promotion. Curtis had presented another strategy at an executive briefing, a client growth plan for a portfolio of mid-market accounts that I had developed over 6 weeks and submitted to him 10 days before the meeting. After the meeting, I went to his office and closed the door behind me. I told him clearly, and without raising my voice, that the plan he had presented was mine, that I had built it from research to final document without his involvement, and that I wanted to understand how the department was going to handle attribution going forward. He let me finish. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "If you want credit, maybe become irreplaceable." That night I wrote out a formal complaint and submitted it through the HR portal before I went to sleep. I documented the Parson Group presentation, the growth plan presentation, the pattern of work going up without my name, and the specific comment he had made. I hit submit and closed my laptop. I expected the process to be slow. I did not expect it to be dishonest. But the HR meeting the following week made the dishonesty clear within the first 4 minutes. After I walked out of the HR meeting with Donna's words still fresh, without documentation, "These claims are hard to prove," I sat at my desk for about 10 minutes doing nothing. Not frozen. Just still. Thinking about the specific combination of words she had used. Without documentation. I had been in that meeting for 40 minutes. I had described a pattern going back over 2 years. I had named specific projects, specific dates, specific phrases. And the response had been to tell me that claims without documentation were difficult to prove. I almost smiled when I thought about my archive folder. Not because I was enjoying any of this, but because there was something almost precise about the alignment between what they needed and what I had. I had 12 emails from Curtis asking me to remove my name. I had the dated log. I had client messages addressed to me by name. I had original files with creation timestamps and my account credentials in the author fields. Donna had told me what was required to be taken seriously. She had no idea she was describing exactly what I already possessed. I opened the folder when I got home that evening and added a new entry to the log, documenting the HR meeting in full. The first crack appeared 10 days after the HR meeting and I had nothing to do with it. The managing director had asked for comprehensive documentation on the Parson Group project to include in a case study the firm was preparing for a new business pitch. Curtis compiled the response and forwarded it to the director's office. But in the compilation, he included an email attachment that he apparently hadn't reviewed carefully before sending. The attachment was a thread, and near the bottom of that thread was the original email I had sent Curtis when I completed the strategy document. The email was dated 6 weeks before the presentation where he had described it as his personal project. My name was in the sender field. The document was attached. And the timestamp was visible to anyone who scrolled to the bottom of the chain. The managing director's assistant, a thorough woman named Kemi, flagged the discrepancy to the director. She had noticed that the original email showed a different author than the one who had presented the work. The director did not raise it publicly. But he started asking questions. Quietly and specifically, the way people ask questions when they already suspect the answer but want to be sure before they say anything out loud. The questions began reaching people below Curtis in the department structure. Oscar told me about the first one. A department vice president had asked him to confirm who had originally developed the client retention framework the firm had been using for the past 18 months. Oscar told the truth. He said I had proposed it in a strategy session and had written the original documentation. The VP thanked him and said nothing more. 2 days later, Kemi asked me directly, by email, whether I had worked on the Parson Group account prior to the renewal. I replied yes and offered to provide the original project files if they would be useful. She said she would follow up. Within the week, I had received 3 separate requests for background documentation on projects publicly associated with Curtis. Each request was framed as a routine audit for business development purposes. But the projects they were asking about were not random. They were the 3 largest successes the department had produced in the past 2 years. The same 3 projects where my name had been absent from every public-facing document. And the person who had been publicly credited with all 3 of them was Curtis. The documentation requests accelerated in the 3rd week after the original email had surfaced. Leadership began pulling archived project files. The requests were going to the IT team rather than to Curtis directly, a deliberate choice that told me the review had moved beyond the curious stage and into something more formal. I provided everything asked of me: originals, version histories, email chains, and the creation metadata showing my account credentials in the author fields. I did not yet volunteer the 12 emails from Curtis asking me to remove my name. I was waiting to see whether the documentation already in the system would tell the story clearly enough on its own. It nearly did. Email chains from multiple projects showed a consistent pattern. I sent completed work to Curtis. Curtis forwarded it with his name attached and mine absent. The pattern was visible across 18 months of project history. 3 department vice presidents had now been pulled into conversations about it. And Curtis, who had been the most confident person in any room for as long as I had known him, had stopped appearing in informal team conversations entirely. His silence was its own signal. The internal review became official in the 4th week. HR, the same department that had dismissed my complaint, issued a formal notice to the team that a review of project attribution practices was underway and that staff might be contacted for interviews. Donna was not listed as the lead reviewer. A different person was named, a man named Philip from the company's compliance function who I had never met but who several colleagues described as thorough and not particularly interested in organizational politics. I was interviewed on a Tuesday morning. I brought my laptop and my external drive. I walked Philip through everything in the archive folder, the 5 categories, the 12 emails, the dated log, the client communications. I did not editorialize. I presented the materials in chronological order and answered his questions directly. He took careful notes throughout. At one point he asked me why I had started keeping the archive. I told him honestly, I had been saving things because I was worried about being blamed for failures in work I had built and then been removed from. He wrote that down. He asked whether I had shared any of this documentation with anyone outside the firm. I told him no. He nodded. He thanked me and said he would be in touch. Philip's team found the email during the second week of the review. I was not told about it directly. Oscar heard about it from a colleague in the compliance team and described it to me later. The email had been sent by Curtis to another department manager, a man named Warren, approximately 9 months earlier. The context was a project presentation being prepared for the managing director. The email said, "Let's keep their name off this presentation. It's cleaner that way." It was attached to the project file, the one I had built entirely. The word there referred to me. Curtis had used the third person to discuss removing my attribution from my own work in a message to appear. The compliance team showed the email to the managing director. According to Oscar, the director had read it twice, set it down, and asked a single question: how many projects does this apply to? The answer the compliance team provided, after their review of the archived records, was 11. 11 projects over 22 months in which my name had been deliberately removed from work I had produced. The review was no longer a quiet internal process. It had become something the legal and compliance teams were now jointly managing. The shift in the office was not announced. It happened in the way that significant things often happen internally, through small signals that collectively meant something undeniable. Curtis stopped sending strategy-related emails to the leadership group. His name came off the agenda for the quarterly client review that had been scheduled for the following month. Faye, who had received the promotion over me, was visibly less certain about where she stood. She had been Curtis's choice, and Curtis's authority was now uncertain in a way that made her positioning uncertain too. And then, gradually, people started speaking with me differently. Not with ceremony or acknowledgement. Just differently. The managing director's office sent me a direct request for input on a client brief. Not routed through Curtis. Not framed as prep work to be assembled for someone else's presentation. Addressed to me, asking for my strategic perspective. I replied with a full analysis. The director replied within 2 hours saying it was exactly what he needed. Oscar sent me a message afterward that said, "Notice anything?" I replied that I had. What I noticed was that the story the company had been telling itself about who was doing the strategic work was being quietly revised. Not announced. Just corrected. In the third week of the review, something happened that no one had engineered or anticipated. 3 clients, Parson Group, a financial services firm called Apple Partners, and a retail chain named Burfield, all mentioned me by name in separate communications to their account contacts. Parson Group's director of marketing sent an email to Kemi asking whether I would be available to join a strategy planning session. Apple Partners VP sent a note through the account channel describing me as the person who had fundamentally redesigned how they thought about client segmentation, work that had been presented to leadership as Curtis's initiative. Burfield's account manager called in and mentioned, in passing, that the system I had set up for their reporting had been the most reliable thing about the relationship in 2 years. None of these clients knew about the review. They were not making a case. They were simply describing their experience of the work honestly and without awareness that those descriptions were landing in the middle of an active investigation. Each one was forwarded to Philip's team by the account management department as relevant documentation. The gap between the official story and the operational reality had now been confirmed from outside the company. Curtis called me on a Thursday evening. I let the first call go to voicemail. He called again 4 minutes later. I answered the second call because I wanted to hear what he had to say without any preparation time on his end. His voice was different, still controlled, but with an effort behind the control that hadn't been there before. He said he thought it would be valuable for us to talk before things got more complicated. He said the review process had taken on a momentum that wasn't good for either of us. He said whatever had happened with attribution, it hadn't been designed to harm me, it had been about protecting the team's presentation of work to leadership. He said leadership responded better to unified voices, and that had been his reasoning. He used the phrase protecting the team 3 times. Then he said he thought there was a way to resolve the situation that would be good for my career going forward. I listened without interrupting. When he stopped speaking, I told him I would think about what he had said. I ended the call, sat quietly for a moment, and then opened my log and wrote out the full conversation from memory, date, time, and everything he had said, as precisely as I could recall. The offer came by email 2 days after the phone call, sent from Curtis's personal email rather than his work address, which told me something about how official he wanted the record to look. It described a new title, Senior Strategist, with a corresponding salary adjustment and a revised role description that would give me formal ownership of the client's strategy function. The compensation was real and the title was the one I had been passed over for when Faye was promoted. Attached to the offer was a 1-page document described as a mutual resolution framework. The document asked me to agree to describe the events of the previous 2 years as a communication misalignment and to affirm, in writing, that the department's project attribution process had reflected normal collaborative practice. It asked me to provide this written affirmation to the review team as part of what it called a collaborative resolution submission. I read the offer twice. The title was real. The money was real. The condition meant presenting a false account of what had happened to the people who were currently reviewing the true account. He was asking me to protect him with the same documentation process that had exposed him. I set the offer aside, opened my email, and forwarded the full message to Philip. I sent Philip the email that evening with a brief note explaining the context, that Curtis had contacted me outside the formal review process and had made an offer conditional on me providing a specific narrative to the review team. I said I wanted to make sure the compliance team was aware of the communication before I made any response to it. Philip replied the following morning. He thanked me and said the communication had been documented as part of the review record. He also said the review was entering its final phase and that he expected to have preliminary findings ready within 10 days. He did not tell me what those findings would contain, but the fact that he was accelerating the timeline after receiving Curtis's offer told me something. The review had been running for 4 weeks. It had started as a documentation audit and had become something considerably more significant. I did not call Curtis back. I did not reply to his email. I went to work the following Monday, sat at my desk, did the work that was in front of me, and waited for the process to run its course. Some things don't need to be pushed. They just need enough time. The second HR meeting was scheduled without explanation, just a calendar invite with Donna's name, a conference room, and a time. No subject line, no agenda. I went in without expectations. But the difference between that meeting and the one 3 weeks earlier was clear from the first minute. Donna was sitting across from me without Curtis in the room. There was a second person present, a woman from the legal team I hadn't met before. Donna began by saying she wanted to revisit the complaint I had filed and to acknowledge that the review process had surfaced information that changed the department's understanding of the situation. She used careful, measured language throughout. She said the investigation had confirmed a pattern of misattribution that had been ongoing and documented. She said the company took that seriously. Then she said something I had not expected. She said, "We owe you an apology for the way the initial complaint was handled. The standard of evidence we asked for was unreasonable given what was available, and the way the meeting was conducted did not reflect how we should have approached your concerns." I sat with that for a moment. Then I thanked her. Not warmly, just professionally. The apology was real, and I accepted it as such. The formal conclusions came 3 weeks later. The managing director issued a communication to the department describing the outcome of the review. The language was precise and institutional. It acknowledged that an internal review had identified a pattern of misrepresentation of work contributions within the department over a period of approximately 22 months. It stated that the review had determined this pattern had been deliberate and sustained. It stated that appropriate action had been taken in response to the findings. Curtis was not named in the communication, but the phrase "department restructuring effective immediately" appeared in the third paragraph, and Curtis's name had already disappeared from the department's organizational chart by the time the email arrived. The official description of his departure was restructuring. Everyone in the department understood what it was. Oscar sent me a message that afternoon. It was 3 words: "Receipts do work." I replied with a single word: always. The department felt different that week, not celebratory, because there was nothing to celebrate in the specific sense. More like the way a room feels when something that has been creating pressure for a long time has finally been removed. Lighter. Not because everything was now good, but because the thing distorting it was gone. 2 weeks after the restructuring announcement, the managing director asked to meet with me privately. He opened the meeting by saying he had reviewed the full documentation and wanted to speak plainly. He said the department had been benefiting from my work for 3 years in ways that had not been properly recognized or compensated. He said the company wanted to correct that. He offered me the senior strategist position, the same title that had been given to Faye 4 months earlier and that I had been passed over for. He said the role had been reconsidered and restructured to reflect what the department actually needed, which was someone with genuine strategic ownership of the client function. The salary was meaningful and the scope was what I had been doing informally for 2 years, now formalized with authority and title. He also said something I held on to. He said, "The work you produced during the Parson Group recovery alone would have justified this promotion. We should have recognized that clearly. I'm sorry it took this long."